Thank you again for joining me in this video. You know, the Money Machine seminar and system is pretty simple, straightforward system. It's designed to increase wealth, and it's designed to give you passive income on retirement. But it's a long-term process. Not hard, but it's long-term. And I've seen over the years a number of people that start and then they fall off the rails. So last video, we talked about some of the reasons why people fall off the rails and some of the things that you can do to avoid that happening. And I want to continue on that theme, talking today about best practices. I want to share with you some of the things, mistakes I've made and some of the things I've learned over the years. And what I want to talk to you about specifically today is the importance of raising the rent on an annual basis. In the province of Ontario, we are under rent controls. Once a year, the government comes out with a magic number, and that's the number that landlords are allowed to increase the rent. And it's always modest. It's always below the cost of living. In fact, during the COVID era, there was one year they gave us a zero increase when the cost of living was running around 8%. And so you always lose some ground. But under the old system, the Landlord and Tenant Act, it used to be that if you didn't raise the rent, you would lose that potential for gain. And when a tenant moved out and a new tenant moved in, you were locked in at the prevailing rent. Now under the Residential Tenancies Act, you still are locked in with an existing tenant on whatever the mandated rent increase is, but when a tenant moves out, you're free to rent it at market rent. What a lot of landlords did at that point, and so did I, was they stopped raising the rent on an annual basis. And they did that because they didn't want to disturb a good tenant. You got a good tenant, everything's wonderful, happy, you're not getting calls, you're not having problems. And you say, why risk having them leave over a minimal increase anyway? And so you wouldn't raise the rent. And the philosophy was, we can always make it up when the tenant leaves. Well, there's a couple, in fact, 3 reasons I want to share with you why that's erroneous thinking and why it's important to raise the rent on an annual basis. The first is that most landlords charge last month's rent on deposit. That guarantees that when the tenant gives notice, you'll get at least 1 month notice. You're supposed to get 2, but you'll get at least 1 if you're holding that last month's rent. But the challenge is that you're required to pay interest on that money you're holding. And the government says whatever the legal increase is for a year, that's the rate of interest you pay for that year. So when a tenant finally moves out, you got to calculate out how long he's been there, what the rent increase was each year, and how much you owe him for interest. On the other hand, if you raise the rent every year to keep abreast exactly with what the legal increase is, then when the tenant moves out, not only do you not owe him interest, but the last month's rent has grown exactly the same pace as the current rent has grown. So it's a wash. It just makes a lot of sense. The other problem is that some tenants never leave. You know, when you don't raise the rent, it gets, relatively speaking, cheaper and cheaper for a tenant to live there. And we've already looked at the fact that the legal increase is always much lower than the cost of living increase. So if you got a long-term tenant, the longer they're there, the cheaper it is compared to market rent. If you are not raising the rent, that gap gets so significant, the only way you're going to change tenants is to outlive them. I've had tenants where they bought property because they wanted to invest in real estate, but they didn't move in themselves. They said, I can't afford to. I can rent it out at market rent, and it's way cheaper to stay where I am. Of course, that's not what you want to have happen, but that's what will happen if you don't raise your rent. And raising the rent won't guarantee that you will keep abreast of market rent. In fact, you won't. We've seen rents go up substantially in the last few years, and there's no way a 2%, 2.5% increase each year is going to keep you abreast. But if you get 2.5% because it's compounding, and for a 10-year period you didn't raise the rent or raise the rent, it can make a difference of 25 or 30% on how much you're receiving rent. It narrows the gap. So there's a lot of reasons why it's important to do that. You will still be maintaining a little bit lower than market rent. In fact, it will be gradually more and more below market rent. A good tenant's not likely to leave. They'll understand the rent increase. Once you do it, they'll get used to it and know that's what's happening. You shouldn't lose a good tenant, but it's just a really good practice, and it'll help you stay in the game financially for the long term. Hope that makes sense. Thank you very much for joining me in this video. Talk to you again next week.